ISPU is a policy research organization with an emphasis on looking at Muslim communities in the US and abroad. We started after September 11th, really with the idea that research and data was going to be needed in the conversations that were happening about our communities going forward. Sort of what led to this study was over the last several years, as we know, there's been an increase in profiling and backlash against Muslim and Arab communities. So this led to a larger motivation for political participation among many communities. And that led to then a greater interest in political and community leaders in how to best engage. So what we did with the support of the Proteus Fund was a year-long study where we worked in partnership actually with Dr. Zogby to look at some of the national survey data that has been collected. One of the key trends that we found, as is in the case with many immigrant communities in the US, is that the Muslim community is quite young. So 60% of the Muslim population nationally is between the ages of 18 and 39. Over a third, about 37% of American Muslims were born in the US. And this is, as we know, a racially diverse group, 30% as Caucasian, 23% as African American, 21% Asian, 6% Hispanic, and others of mixed race. The concentration of the Muslim community nationally is higher in certain states. And what's sort of interesting is that a couple of these states are actually key swing states, so Michigan and Florida, Ohio, Virginia, Pennsylvania. These are all states where even small groups of voters can make a big difference in elections. Increasingly, American Muslims, particularly in these political environments, are saying that their Muslim identity is important to how they vote. So this is, I think, another key area for our communities to pay attention to. American Muslims actually have some of the highest rates of voter registration. And as with other communities, as communities grow older, their rates of voter registration increase. So I'm going to turn this over now to Daniel, who's going to talk a bit about the work that he did in Florida.
So Islamophobia tends to be that binding link for Muslims. So for instance, maybe Muslims were not linked together into some whole to actually form some sort of voting bloc. But once you put it into a context of Islamophobia, where you have a lot of people being bigoted and hateful towards you, then what happens is that then you start to say, you know what, that's right, I am a Muslim, I identify as a Muslim, and I'm going to have to do something to actually change the situation if I want to empower myself. Now, Florida tends to be a swing state. The nice thing about that is that minority communities can have a big impact here. For instance, in Orange County, which is where we're at, Muslim percentage of voters makes up around 2% of the registered voters. So registered Muslim voters make up around 2% of the registered voters. Now, Orange County, and Orlando in particular, is one of these metropolitan areas that's influencing even the national political stage. So, for instance, you're going to get a lot of people coming here, a lot of the Republican candidates. Of course, Obama will probably show up, pop up at some point. And you're going to have them courting the vote down here. Now, 2% of the registered voters, if they vote in mass, in block, considering the marginal status of Florida, it can have a huge influence on the elections if they vote together. Emerge has actually gone out and they've done a lot of research into this. They've actually looked at how many registered Muslim voters are there in the state, and no one's ever done that before. And actually, they've managed to build a database of 123,759 people. One of the issues that are important to Muslims in Florida is the economy and jobs, which makes sense. You know, and a lot of people say, oh, what it is foreign policy. No, actually, foreign policy only made up 15% of the issue of importance for the Muslim community in Florida. Almost half of it was jobs and the economy, which makes a lot of sense. Really, Florida, and this is one, I did interviews with Emerge USA leadership, and I asked them, you know, what do you see Muslim mobilization in Florida? How do you see the Muslim mobilization in the next 10 years, next 20 years? Do you see them being more active in politics? One of the funniest things that Karam, the director of Emerge, said to me was, if they can do it in Florida, they can do it anywhere else. I was kind of curious about that, so I asked, you know, how is that possible? He said, It's like, look, the Muslim community in Florida has more challenges than any other state in this country. Now, that was a big statement, and I asked him, like, could you elaborate? And of course, one of the big things was, of course, the linking or the bonding effect of Islamophobia. And if you haven't noticed in the past year or couple years, this state has really put itself on the map for being one of the places where Islamophobia is high. There was more Islamophobic activity in Florida than there is in most other states. You can see in the data, for instance, this Council on American Islamic Relations, they provide a lot of data on civil rights violations, etc. Florida is one of the top 5 states for this. So, since this is a bonding effect, Islamophobia on the Muslim community, actually it could be a benefit for them. Having a lot of Islamophobic politicians, a lot of Islamophobic speakers and bloggers and everybody else actually can bind this Muslim community, or it could sink. It could actually flounder in the face of this opposition. Unfortunately, you see a lot of people doing that. The Muslim community has a great opportunity to stand up for themselves, to get themselves heard, but they can also sink back into the shadows and become, the continuous scapegoat. And of course, that would actually hurt the Muslim community more.
Big issue now is the question of profiling and discrimination, which we've seen open up this gap. And it's not just, interestingly enough, a gap with Muslims or with Arabs, but it's a gap with a whole lot of folks, including young people, who look at Republicans being intolerant, whether intolerant toward Muslims, intolerant toward blacks, intolerant toward gays, intolerant toward any minority group, and they get turned off. So the question I wanted to start with, if I could, and I'm going to start right here, is if you could just, from what you've read in the report and what in your own experience, comment on just the first two, the age and the immigrant versus born here, differences that you find in reactions within your community.
Again, Nayef Mubarak with the AACC. I want to thank Dr. Zogby for being here. I don't think he got an introduction as well, but we all know his reputation precedes him. So, as far as the age groups and the immigrant versus the American-born voter in the United States, I think there's a few things that come into play here. First, as far as age comes in, and my age as a young male and experience with my cousins, they're the ones who were almost discouraged from voting. We voted in 2000, we voted in 2008, it's now 2012, and we have not only Republicans, but candidates in general just using defamatory language against Arabs and Muslims. At this point, what's the point in voting? And you constantly have to serve as a reminder that, our numbers are strengthening, we're becoming noticed. Eventually, we're going to have this ability and be acknowledged as a group that should be respected and not even tolerated, but simply respected. Because I think the Arabs and Muslims who are discouraged from voting have put a fire under their behinds to get back in the booth, because we have to defend ourselves in this type of hot rhetoric where if we don't vote, we're simply allowing this machine and this intolerant machine to get back into power.
Howard, I want to ask you about the issue component of this trigger. You've been doing this work for a long time, and Daniel made a comment about Florida. I would suggest nationally it's a problem. Have you seen an environment like this? And does it become a mobilizer or a demobilizer?
The issues of interest, I thought, where the polls showing that the principal area of interest was involved the economy and jobs. I think that reflects everybody's principal concern. I do think, though, that, and maybe especially for the younger people, the notion of Islamophobia, harassment, discrimination, policies that target Muslims or people with Muslim-sounding names, or whether it's from the Far East, the Middle East, the Near East, North Africa, or whatever, those kinds of policies, I do think are a mobilizing impact. And I think some of the politicians here in Florida that have jumped on board on that issue, we have a prominent member of Congress who is probably one of the principal Islamophobes in the country. We just had a battle in the Florida legislature where we were able to kill what was a thinly veiled attack, I think, on the Muslim community, although it didn't mention Sharia law. Everybody in the world knew what that piece of legislation was all about. I do think that those are mobilizing aspects. One of the things I want to add about that I think makes it more mobilizing is because I think the younger community really understands and appreciates after 9/11 on those kinds of issues, even though we're seeing more of those kinds of profiling tactics. But you remember right after 9/11, then President Bush said, oh, the last thing we want to do is blame the entire Muslim community, and we're going to be tolerant about this and not blame everybody for the acts of a few and so on. That's what they said. But then when you looked at the policies that were then implemented by then Attorney General John Ashcroft, they were all policies that profiled young men from Muslim countries. I think the issue that mobilizes primarily is because people remember those policies and see that those policies were not simply harassment and discrimination. They were all thinly veiled programs to try to deport people out of this country. And I think that's one of the significant mobilizing concerns about what happens if you don't stand up and fight Islamophobia.
Well, first I wanted to thank ISPU and Daniel and Shireen for this report that they put together. It was incredible. Also, I am here as a representative of Emerge USA. Well, with regard to ethnicity as a driver, the research that we've done at Emerge, as Daniel kind of touched upon, has shown that while Muslims do have very strong, I mean, as we all know, Muslims and Arabs have very, very strong political opinions, especially about views affecting our backgrounds in our countries. But I would say the primary impact or the primary effect of our ethnicities touches more upon our status as immigrants and coming from backgrounds where, as Daniel stated, our folks weren't encouraged to get involved, or if they were, if they were involved, they were putting themselves at risk. And I think, all of us, and I think that really ties into the age driver that you mentioned as well earlier, because what we're seeing is with, second and third generations growing up here in the country, I'm sure anybody here can relate when I say, parents will be tracking their kids' Facebook accounts and, why are you so political? Don't say those things. And I think the true impact upon, likelihood or not of voting when it comes to ethnicity, really it ties into a generation above us whose responsibility was really to make sure that our mosques were built, and the generations below them now, our generations, ensuring that those mosques stay there and they're not taken away. And so it's really our generation of immigrants who have had the responsibility to get involved, and I think I have answered that call, especially in Florida.
Howard, you mentioned the thinly veiled Sharia legislation here. Just interesting, the same language was tried in Michigan. They spoke about not using foreign law, but Canada's right next door, and too many Michigan businesses do business with Canada, which, whether you like it or not, is a foreign country. They sound like us and look like us and talk like us, but they're not us. And so it was Canada that squashed it up there. I'm not sure people are going to do business with Cuba anytime soon, so you didn't have that asset down here. But you had that one, and it was a win. And there is Allen West down here, and that's a big one. What other issues will be sort of front and center when we get closer to November that will be sort of accelerators in this process?
Well, that's really a good question. I really tend to think, this is a generic comment, that when a community is under attack, that it makes the community more cohesive.
Mhm.
And so you say there is no, it's interesting, you say there is no Muslim vote, or there is no Muslim community. I recognize that there is, you can't paint any community with a broad brush, but, and my God, that has to be more true of the Muslim community when there are, you know, Muslims from Indonesia to American-born Muslims. I mean, it is probably one of the most diverse communities, if not the most diverse community. But nevertheless, when being Muslim is so looked upon with suspicion by politicians and by so much of the community, when we have not yet arrived at the situation, which I do think we need to get to, and which we will get to, and look back at this unhappy period in American history in which Islamophobia is looked upon as, with as much impermissibility for the general public and for the political leadership as anti-Semitism, that it is as inappropriate to be anti-Semitic as it is to be Islamophobic when we get to that. But we haven't gotten to that yet. And when the entire Muslim community is under suspicion, and it, I think, unifies that community, I think it's more likely that's an issue. That, I mean, you asked what's an issue. This isn't kind of like a piece of legislation, but it's the attitude of suspicion and skepticism towards that we get from some American political leaders that I think will unify the community. Somebody said earlier, and I think it's absolutely correct, it fits into the broader context of intolerance towards immigrants. And I think even though it may not even apply directly to the Muslim community, that immigration and immigration policy is going to be one of the major issues. Sure. You know, the economy will be the principal issue, but immigration and immigration policy and the DREAM Act and all those will be issues that will be fought out in this presidential campaign. And the Muslim community, I think, will see intolerance towards immigrants and the immigrant community as also applying to them, even though it's probably will be fought out primarily in the language about the Hispanic community.
Thank you.